there's a whole different world when you look at vintage watches too. There are records that have been broken recently. Rolex Daytona's going for $500,000 US. Very special Daytona's going for in the millions. So it's such an open-ended question. We could talk about it for the rest of the night, I think.
Hi, everybody. This is Joseluiz Morales. Welcome back to the Morales Group Show. This is episode number 75. Today, we've got a very special guest. His name is Norbert Schmeidler. He is a luxury watch and vintage watch expert. And today, we're going to be deviating a little bit from real estate. And Norbert is going to guide us on how the luxury market works for watches, and whether a watch is an investment, a liability, or just kind of depending which way you look at it. Welcome to the show, Norbert. How are you?
Thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited to share my passion with you and your viewers.
Thank you for being on. Now, before we get into the interview, I just want to remind our viewers, if you've seen some of our previous interviews and you've enjoyed our content, make sure to hit that subscribe button on YouTube. Now, I just wanted to start off by just asking, who is Norbert and how did you get into the luxury and vintage watch market?
Sure. So I guess like the easy answer is I'm a third culture kid. I'm originally from South Africa, but grew up in Europe and spent a lot of my life in Switzerland. Mm-hmm. I think it's pretty hard to not pick up certain hobbies when you live in Switzerland. So soccer or football is one of them. I guess chocolate is another, and then watches is probably a big one. As far as like getting into watches, living in Switzerland obviously, had an effect on that, but my father was also into watches, and there was sort of a tradition in my family to gift a watch to your children once they graduate from high school. Mm-hmm. And so throughout my high school experience, I knew that was sort of coming and did a little bit of research into it. And so that really sort of started off the passion, and it kind of just snowballed from there. It's difficult to get out of too. I've noticed you kind of, when you dive into it, there's just so much depth that you can go into for watches. So
that's awesome. And just out of curiosity, as the gift of the watch, do you get to select it in your family, or is it just almost like up to the giver as to which watch they want to give to you?
It's up to the giver. So it's you can maybe show a couple, say, hey, Dad, I'm liking this one. What do you think about it? But it's up to the giver, which I think is a little bit more special because it's their way of saying, this reminds me of you, or this is something I think I'd see you wearing. So
that is so cool. Yeah. I had a friend recently that told me that he wanted to pass on his watch to his son, but this sounds like it's a little bit different. You mind me asking what watch you picked and why?
Sure. So I actually was lucky enough to be featured on a Hodinkee article, which is sort of like the gospel for watches. But Hodinkee.com, I was featured on there. And the watch that I was gifted from my high school was a Tag Heuer Link caliber 16 chronograph. It's very simple chronograph from a really great brand. Mm-hmm. Of course, I didn't pick it. My parents sort of picked it for me, but I did sort of tell them, I'm definitely interested in getting a chronograph. So that kind of helped. But what was cool is I spoke about this watch on Hodinkee, and I was able to actually show this watch side by side with a pocket watch that was gifted to my great grandfather. So it was nice to sort of have the generational, the generations of watches all kind of lined up in that. So.
This is just for personal knowledge. How long has that tradition been going on in your family? Like, it sounds like your grandfather, was it your great-grandfather, great-great-grandfather? Do you have any idea on that?
Yeah. So fun fact about me, I guess, I'm actually the fourth Norbert in my family. So it goes back to Norbert the First, who was gifted a pocket watch. So I guess you could say four or five generations. So
I love that. My son is the third Joseluiz.
Okay. Sounds like a tradition you got to start then.
Yeah, I know. It's actually a really cool one. Cool. So you got your first watch. then at what stage did you get into like the buying and selling of watches, and how old were you at that time when you did that?
Yeah, so graduated from high school, and then the year after, sort of in college, when I was not wanting to study, I started just sort of looking at watches and seeing, wow, these are really, this is an investment potential, because when you look at a watch and you say, oh, this could definitely go up in value, or this is underpriced, why are they selling it for this? That was sort of when it started. So it was literally when I turned 19, I started researching, um, I guess you could call it flipping watches, but really I was doing it from an enthusiast perspective. So I was a little bit more on the vintage side. And that was sort of the start for me, where it was, I'm in college, I don't want to study. I'm just going to take a look at some watches for this time. So
Perfect. Okay. Can maybe you walk us through like your first actual sale of like a luxury or vintage watch? Like, how did you acquire it? Who was the buyer? And maybe even if you remember the numbers at all, or this memorable sale that you had as it relates to a luxury watch?
yeah. So I actually remember the watch. I don't remember the reference for it, but it was a vintage watch. It was a watch from a company called Universal Genève. They're a Swiss brand, and they're really known for chronographs, or vintage chronographs. They're called uni compacts, which is just a fancy word of saying it's a watch with a timer on it.
Okay.
And so I noticed that this was a watch that collectors really loved. I was on forums and sort of reading a lot of articles about these watches, and it seemed like there was a real love for the uni compacts. So started looking online. I don't suggest this. I was on eBay, just seeing what they had out there, and ended up finding a uni compacts that was in really great condition, being sold by a couple who were just trying to get a little bit of cash, which is an unfortunate story, because you're taking a watch away from them. I want to say it at the top of this video, I'm an enthusiast for watches. Like, I just love the mechanical aspects of them, not really like the money they can make off of them. But so obviously they were accepting best offers, so I made my best offer, and I think because they were a little bit looking for cash, it was a little bit easier to find a deal. I think I got it for about $1,000 US, not a lot of money, or I should actually say $1,000 is a lot of money to some people, but not a lot of money for this reference. I'd say these were probably going for about 1,800 at the time. So bought the watch, and for me, it was actually just to wear it and enjoy it. Like, that was why I bought it. But then I started sort of looking at other watches, and in college, $1,000 is a lot for a college student. So was decided, I think I'll sell this watch. And I ended up selling it for about 2,200 at the time. So it had appreciated a little bit in the time that I had owned it. It went to a good collector friend of mine that I went to high school with. He was looking for uni compacts. He's sort of this specific collector is really into vintage chronographs. He's got a wide range of chronographs in his collection, everything from Patek Philippe vintage to Longines chronographs. And so he was looking to add something like this. So I think meeting that need was a little bit helpful in the transaction at the end of the day. So
it sounds like it almost happened a little bit by accident. Like, you bought it for yourself, and then at some point, maybe you wanted to move on to another watch, or you saw that there was a buyer out there, and essentially you got to enjoy it, but also you got to make a profit on it as well too. Just out of curiosity, when you said I don't suggest that people go on eBay and buy a watch, why was that?
Yeah, buying watches on eBay it's a tough thing to do. I think my best advice is you need to hold the watch that you're looking to. You have to hold it in your hand, put it on your wrist to understand what it is. Pictures on eBay can be great, but it's hard to really gauge the condition of the watch. It's hard to gauge if it actually fits your style. I go, if I sort of split it out, if I think about it from like a collector's perspective, you want to know that this is a watch that you want. Certain collectors have opinions on the condition that they want for their watches. They have opinions on how the watch fits their wrist. Maybe it's too big, too small. So like from a collector's perspective, putting on your wrist is an important aspect. But then if you're looking at from maybe like if you want to call it watch flipping perspective, it's hard to gauge if it's fake, if it's all original, if there are things on it that you don't want. If you're looking for a completely brand new watch and there's a little scratch on it and you're not able to hold it and see it, makes it a little bit hard to come to a deal and be happy with your purchase at the end of the day. So, yeah.
How does somebody know if something is fake or real? Like, like I was in Colombia when I was like 25 or something like that. Literally, like you had vendors coming up to you saying $100. It looked real in my eyes. It looked like a fake. It was a Rolex, but a fake one. It was like $100, but it looks so real, like at least to me. But then again, I'm not like somebody that understands that. Is there a large fake market for watches out there, and how does somebody protect themselves when buying a watch on the secondary market?
Yeah, fakes are a huge. I'm gonna call it a problem because I guess I'm a real watch guy, right? It's very difficult to figure out fakes, and it's becoming more and more difficult. Just another sort of anecdotal story. I spent a lot of time in Turkey when I lived in Switzerland, and Turkey is very similar to Colombia. They had vendors who had tons of fake watches, and it was 35 euros for a Rolex. I think the price is maybe your tip off there. Rolex is not going to be selling for that type of price. The easiest way to tell if a watch is fake or not is, well, I think there's two main ways. You really have to be familiar with the reference that you're looking at. So let's say you're looking at a Rolex Submariner. You should look up that reference, get really familiar with the proportions of the hands, the way that the dial is laid out, how the case is finished. All those things are sort of tip-offs of this could be a fake watch that I'm looking at. The second thing is going into the watch and looking at the movement. So mechanical watches have movements inside of them that basically allow the watch to tell time. And that's a good indication as to whether or not it's created by Rolex. It's to that high quality that Rolex creates. So that's a nice tip off. However, and there's always a however, now it's getting even harder for watchmakers to actually tell if the movement was manufactured by Rolex. Fake watch, fake watch companies are getting really great at replicating the movements. And so I think the best piece of advice I have is become best friends with a really, really good watchmaker. If you buy a watch, make sure that you have enough time to take it to your watchmaker and say, hey, could you check this out and make sure it's real, to make sure it's original. I think that's, you'll if you get into watches, you'll find a watchmaker that will be your best friend. So
that's funny. I always heard before I bought my watch, the Rolex, I always heard that watches were a good investment, or that over time watches go up in value. It was really hard for me to believe that, because I look at it as an investment, like a piece of property. I'm very heavily invested in real estate. But do watches always go up in value? And which watches generally go up in value the most, or what are some of the most popular watch brands, if you wouldn't mind elaborating on that?
Sure. I'm going to say it again. I'm a watch enthusiast. I do this because I love the watches, but there is a side of watches where they can appreciate in value, like you mentioned. I think the way that you can kind of look at watches as a investment vehicle is, as a person, you should have diversified assets that can generate some sort of passive income for you, if you want to describe it that way. I think watches are a tangible asset class that you can get into. It's not going to be your bread and butter. It's not going to be your to the moon shot sort of investment. But I think it is a way that you can take a little bit of money that you may have, put it into something that you enjoy, and basically benefit from the appreciation of those watches. be a watch enthusiast first, and then you can reap the benefits of the investment side of things. I think there's obviously big case studies. Rolex is a big name that everyone knows. I did an article, I think at the beginning of this year, looking at some of the different references that I think have gone up in value tremendously from Rolex and Omega. As an example, there's a watch called the Rolex Submariner. It's nicknamed the Hulk. It's basically a Submariner with a green dial and a green bezel. I looked at it, what the values were 10 years ago and what it was now. It was about 173% increase over that time period. So 10 years, 173%, it's a decent return, but not every watch is going to do that. I think if you want to get into this, I think it's about finding watches that basically collectors love. The reason why the Rolex Submariner is a great example, because people love sports watches. They love sort of the history of dive watches. Sports watches are kind of fit their lifestyle. So if you find those types of watches in other brands, you could benefit from the appreciation of them over time. So I think Rolex is a great example. Omega has a lot of potential. I did a similar sort of study on those watches too. Not as large returns as Rolex, but Rolex is sort of it feels like a commodity to me. Rolex is another great example. Some other brands that maybe are less known but still could appreciate in value. I think Tudor, they create very similar watches to Rolex, and so because of that, a lot of people are saying, I don't have to spend $8,000-9,000. I could spend $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 and still get a similar feel to the watch. And so more and more people are getting into Tudor. And I think the last one I want to talk about is Longines. I think Longines is a Swiss brand that I think they did a lot right, and they also did a lot wrong in some of their watches. But I think right now they're sort of on that right path. They've kind of pulled on their heritage a little bit more, and that's pulling in more and more collectors. So I think there's some potential for them there too. But I will say, this is not investment advice. I simply just talking from a passion perspective.
That's awesome. Good. And then what would you say is one of the most expensive watches out there? Is there a certain brand that's just known to be the most expensive?
It's such a hard question. If you could look at it, this is from many angles. You could look at, companies like Richard Mille. They create kind of sports-inspired watches, but they do things like tourbillons and specific metals, and those can go for in excess of hundreds of thousands of US dollars. But then you could look at something a little bit more classic. So if you go to brands like Patek Philippe and Vacheron Constantin, you can look at some of their more some of their hot horology, minute repeater, very complicated pieces. And those can go, as well in excess of hundreds of thousands of US dollars. And then, there's a whole different world when you look at vintage watches too. There are records that have been broken recently. Rolex Daytona is going for $500,000 US. Very special Daytonas going for in the millions. So it's such an open-ended question. We could talk about it for the rest of the night, I think. So
that's awesome. If somebody wanted to find somewhat of a good deal on a watch, how would they go about doing that? Or is there such a thing as a good deal on a vintage or even luxury watch?
I'd say in the last 10 years, it's become a lot harder to find good deals in watches. I think it's twofold. The first is collectors are keeping the good watches. They're finding they found the ones that are in good condition. They want to keep them in their collection, and it's sort of like the center of what they're collecting. And then the second thing is, now that everyone is sort of into this sort of passive income, invest in alternatives world, Pokemon cards, I'll put real estate there as well. But now that people are into that, I think watches is something that people have gone into as well. And so you'll notice that prices have probably inflated a little bit because of that energy behind this alternative stream of income that these watches can generate. So it's hard to find good deals. I would recommend trying to find some sort of collector network if you are looking to maybe get into watches or finding good deals for watches. Because I think that sort of network allows you to, we'll say wheel and deal. It's not wheeling and dealing. It's more just creating connections and finding people who maybe want to get rid of a watch or two. So
yeah, it's funny because I had dinner with a client last week. We closed on a transaction, and he shows me a picture, and it was like 15 different Rolexes, and I would have never guessed that from this client, but he had like 15 different Rolexes, and he started telling me the stories about the different ones, and he was telling me that this one has gone up in value this much, and that one has gone up in value that much, which to me was really interesting because that was not the first person that it was probably the first person that I personally know that had like that I can refer to as a friend that had a watch collection like that. So to me, it was really interesting. Is there a shortage of luxury watches right now? Like I hear that maybe the pandemic caused a little bit of a shortage. Is that true or no?
So one of the other things we do on our website is sort of cover export results from Switzerland. And we noticed a real decline into some of the large markets due to the pandemic. But I think we're sort of on the way back to our 2019 numbers. The last couple of months, we've sort of hit, or Switzerland has sort of hit that 1.9 billion in exports, which was sort of where they were in 2019. But as far as a shortage of watches, I'd say absolutely, especially the watches that our collectors are looking for. And I think that's sort of created a real kind of fight between your authorized dealer sort of first-hand market and your second-hand market, gray market dealers. Just to go into the structure a little bit more. So obviously companies like Rolex and Omega, they're not going to go to every city and open up boutiques in all of them. They're going to leverage dealers to sell some of their watches through. So a dealer will go through a certification process and become an authorized dealer of a specific brand, let's say Rolex. And so with that deal that they have, they're allocated a certain amount of watches every time period, let's say every quarter. The problem is the allocations that they get are not meeting the demand for those specific references. So there's a lot of people joining wait lists to try and get specific watches, and it's a real fight to actually get into finding a reference completely new from an authorized dealer. And so what emerged from that is the secondhand gray market dealers who somehow are able to get a hold of these references that people are looking for, but because they know that the supply of these watches from authorized dealers is so bad, they're able to sort of inflate their prices and say, hey, you're not going to find another one of these. You should buy from me and buy at a $2,000-$3,000 markup on some of these watches, right? And so it's become a real big problem, and you're seeing it in a lot of different watches. There's watches that are supposed to sell for, $8,000-9,000 US, and they're selling for $14,000, $15,000, $16,000 US on the gray market. And I think that's another part of the whole finding a good deal in watches is becoming extremely difficult.
Harder because of the shortage. Did you say gray market?
Yeah, gray market's just a way to describe some dealers who perhaps aren't 100% certified by or backed by a company. I think secondhand market's more like it was new. We bought it from someone, so we have a secondhand watch. The gray market's like I have brand new watches, but I don't have any authorization. I'm not an authorized dealer or anything like that. So you're kind of like scratching your head, like I don't know how you got these, but yeah.
That's so. There's the authorized dealer. Then there's the secondary market, which is basically people that are buying and selling watches. And then there's the gray market, which is like brand new watches that they're not an authorized dealer. So you're kind of wondering how did they potentially get them? Have you ever bought a watch that maybe was a fake, like early on in your career at all, or a bad watch that maybe like had something that wasn't right with it?
Yeah, no, and I should say when you get into collecting watches, I think the biggest thing that you should do is try and buy and experience watches as much as possible because you get better at identifying the problems with them. I am an open book. I've done videos and articles about where I've been scammed on Rolex watches that I've purchased because I think it's a way that people can learn from my mistakes, and I think that's the best way to go about it. But there are watches that I've bought felt something was off about it, had my watchmaker take a look at it. Obviously something was wrong with it. And because I have my network, I can sort of go back to the person I bought it from and say, hey, there's something not right about this, and sort of reverse the transaction.
Mm-hmm.
That's why I think the network is so important to have, because if you buy it from someone and that's that, it's very difficult to go back and say, hey, this doesn't feel right. I don't want this watch in my collection, or it doesn't feel right to me. So
I know you've touched on the network a couple of times. Like, how did you go about building that network? Like, just in case somebody ever wants to get into this type of industry or market.
Yeah, I was fortunate enough to grow up in a place where there were watch enthusiasts, but I think there's a lot of outlets for you to get involved in it, in watches. I think a classic one for people getting into watches is join some watch forums. There's watch forums like Rolex Watch Forum, but there's plenty of them out there for you to sort of get involved, learn about watches, and meet some really cool people. One thing that I did sort of during the pandemic was I joined an app called Clubhouse. I'm sure many of you and many of your viewers may know them, but Clubhouses, they had a real boom in the watch community where people actually just jumped on and said, hey, let's talk about watches for an hour. And this was during a time where a lot of watch companies had released new watches for the year. And so it was really great to talk about some of the new references that companies had produced for that year. And it was also a nice way to spend your pandemic, right? So
that's awesome. It's funny, when speaking to you, I can hear the passion about the watches, which is good, obviously, that you're passionate about it. And this question kind of goes to that. If you can buy any watch in the world, which watch would it be, and why?
Jeez, yeah, that's a tough question. I feel like it would change, 10 minutes from now. I'll tell you a watch that sort of has been on my mind for many years now, just because I really love the brand and the design of the watch. It's from a company called MB&F, which is it's an independent watch company, so a lot smaller production numbers, and really focuses on really the producing high quality watches. The watch that I have been eyeing for years now is called Legacy Machine Number 1. So the watches that they produce, they sort of have two lines, and the one is the Legacy Machine, which is what would this brand create if they were around 100 years ago. And so you find this very sort of classical watchmaking with this modern flair to it. And the way that this watch is structured is it's got it's a round case, and it has this domed crystal. So if you look at my watch here, instead of being sort of a flat crystal with a dial, you actually have a dome on it. And there's a piece of the movement that they've actually taken from the inside of the case, and they've put it on top of the dial. And it's the beating heart of the watch. It's called the balance wheel. And it actually oscillates on the top of your watch. And so when you look at it, I love it so much because you really connect with the running of this piece. It's very difficult to find them. They're going at expensive prices at auctions. I mean, it's great to see a small watch company do this, but hopefully I'll be able to find one soon so I can sort of add it to my collection.
That's funny. When you say expensive at auction, what does that mean? Like, are we talking like 100,000, 500, $1 million?
Sure. Watches at auction are not like paintings that can go for the millions. I think when they breach that, you're talking about a serious watch.
Yeah.
The Legacy Machine Number 1, I'd say right now is around $60,000 on the secondhand market. But there was, I believe, an auction at Christie's where an LM1 went for about 96,000 Swiss francs. So you're looking at a big difference in market versus sort of secondhand market, or auction versus secondhand market. I think that's sort of where I talk about expensive, when it's more than sort of what it's on the secondhand market.
Yeah. Is there ever a watch that you regret selling, that you bought and that you sold it and you're like, man, I should have kept that one, and why? And which watch was it, and why?
Yeah, that story happens every day, it feels like. Yeah, I guess I could talk about one that we actually sourced for our for Life on the Wrist to sell to a collector. This was a Patek Philippe reference 2594. It's a time-only watch, but it was produced in the late 60s, early 70s, and sort of it's nicknamed Disco Volante, which is sort of like it looks like a flying saucer on your wrist. It's not everyone's cup of tea, but I really loved the way that the case was finished. And what's nice about running Life on the Wrist is if I find a watch that I have for the store and I really like it, I can hold on to it, right? And I was contemplating this, and then a collector reached out to me and said, "Hey, I'm really looking for this reference." So I let go of it, and literally I put it in the post. And I said, shoot, I don't want to do this. But I had already agreed to it and said, you know what, I can probably find one of these some other time. You fall in love with these watches. At least I think I fall in love with these watches. And it's sometimes hard to let go.
What is your, do you hold on to a decent amount of them now, or are you mainly sourcing watches for collectors? And if so, what would you say the collection looks like?
I've tried to separate sort of looking for watches for my own personal collection versus looking for watches for Life on the Wrist, so that I don't have these catastrophic experiences. Yeah, I'd say the collection is growing. It's not growing at a rate that it maybe was before. Just for safety reasons, I don't really want to get into like the specifics of my collection, but I'd say I've picked up maybe 2 watches for the collection in the last 8 or 9 months. And, that feels like a very slow process to me. So you can understand how many watches I'm probably touching every month. So
that's great. Yeah. Good for you. Congratulations on that. Okay. And then I think this is the last question that I wanted to ask you. I'm a little bit unclear on the luxury watch market versus the vintage watch market. How would you describe the difference between both of those?
Sure. So I would say wearing a mechanical watch on your wrist, I think in general, no matter how much it costs, is a luxury. We all have iPhones. We probably all have Apple Watches or some sort of smart device that can tell us the time. So no matter if it's $200, $2,000, $200,000, I think anything that you're wearing on your wrist is a luxury watch. But I think the divide between maybe the modern luxury watch market and the vintage luxury watch market is vintage watches are watches that were produced in previous decades, right? I'd call maybe the cutoff the 80s is sort of the cutoff for me right now of what is vintage versus what's a modern watch. If you're looking at a Rolex Submariner from the 90s, I'd probably classify that maybe a little bit more towards the modern side of things. Whereas if you're looking at maybe a vintage Omega Speedmaster from the 60s, you're definitely looking at the vintage side of things there.
Yeah. Awesome. Cool. Anything else that you think our viewers would enjoy from luxury/vintage watches?
Yeah. I guess just final notes from me, I'd say something that I mentioned was watches are a really interesting area for you to explore as someone who might want to pick up a hobby. There's so much history behind the watches. Watches can have really interesting stories attached to them. And there's really interesting mechanics that these watchmakers have created and put into these watches. And that's something that at Life on the Wrist we try to bring to life is watchmakers have made a huge impact in just mechanics in general. And the watches that they produce are really beautiful and they can come with really interesting stories. So if you are interested in learning a new hobby or finding out about a watchmaker who produced something that's still influencing watchmaking today, I think just starting off on the path of doing a little research into a brand can teach you something and really kind of fill your time with something that you may enjoy. Luxury watches there's so many out there, and so it would take you a lifetime to really experience them all. And so maybe just taking the first step by saying, hey, I'm going to look at Longines today. Let me see what I can find out is a nice way to sort of enter into luxury watches.
Perfect. And then if somebody wanted to get a hold of you, maybe somebody wanted to source a watch or maybe just kind of talk to you about getting into the business, how would somebody go about doing that?
Sure. Yeah, you can head over to our website, lifeonthewrist.com. We have a contact us page, or you can find our email on our website. But feel free to message us on any of our social medias. We are super active there. I love talking about watches. As you can see, it's a passion of mine. So drop us a line. We're more than happy to help you or educate you about something, or just talk watches.
That's awesome, man. Well, I could see the passion, obviously, in your voice. And the one thing that I would say is you seem very authentic, like extremely, extremely authentic in the way that you communicate. So I've enjoyed the interview. Thank you so much. This was episode number 75 of the Morales Group, luxury watch / vintage watches. We had Norbert Schmeidler here with us. Thank you so much, and we'll stay tuned for the next episode. Thank you, guys.